All right, we're about to start the question and answer session. I think the most frequent question, the one that was asked most, was the one that can be asked the easiest, except for the fact that Stuart Reid's book sold out today. And that is asking Stuart to comment on the sources. Anyone who reads Stuart's book can delve into those footnotes and see what his sources were. The amazing thing, of course, is that Stuart wrote the book from the United Kingdom and had to have a lot of help from archivists and interlibrary loan and other people that he might mention. But I guess the best spin on that question is one person who asked, of all these sources that you used, which ones did you find that were the least known and most helpful in your work?
Oh, one of these how long is a piece of string questions. Well, it's actually two questions. If you're talking about the least known, I would say the least known were the sources I found in the British National Archives, which are obviously, being British and the Kew at London, not generally accessible to researchers in Texas, or indeed anywhere else in the United States. Generally speaking, however, I would say that there are two most important sources for me were the Green DeWitt Colony site, which is a massive resource of temporary documentation, and the portal. Without either of those, that book could never have been written.
Both of these online sources?
Both online sources, including the complete set of GAML, which I downloaded.
And Stuart was telling me last night or this morning about one particular transcription that he was reading, and it's the letter from, is it Carr?
James Carr, yeah.
Yeah.
That's in the Austin papers. There is a published transcript of the Austin papers in the National Archives in Great Britain. Why, I'm not entirely sure, but it's there and I was very grateful for it. One day I was steadily going through, lids getting heavier and heavier. Yes, very interesting, but we're not really getting anywhere. Until I found this letter from a colonist named James Kerr, which I've mentioned before in this talk this morning. Kerr was sent to find out exactly what was going on in Nacogdoches, what this Fredonian nonsense was all about. And he proceeded to say, well, the British appear to be behind it because X, Y, and Z. And he's saying, well, there's this guy, John Donne Hunter, who's causing a bit of trouble. There's another guy, Barnett, I think it was, either way. And there's also this Dr. Somebody. In that moment, the penny dropped, and I said, yeah, gotcha! And there's silence.
You said this in the library.
And there's all sorts of people prairie dogging. Big, happy, indulgent smiles on their faces. So I said, yeah, buckle down, go on with transcribing it. But it's one of these things that's had its moment. And I've had help from people. It's not just been a solitary. As I mentioned in the book, one of the more exciting bits, Warren Stricker from the library in Behar sent me, very kindly sent me a copy of Reuben Brown's account, one of Reuben Brown's accounts of Grant's death. But he was only able to do it in stages. And his computer crashed halfway through. Just as he'd reached the lines, the Mexicans burst from the trees and we whirled around and
then the
took
computer crashed.
24 hours to get the rest of the sentence. But it's been fun. I can recommend researching on the internet to anybody. It really gets a grip on you.
Yeah, and I would heartily recommend Stuart's book. Let me ask one follow-up question to that. Except for that letter, the Dr. Somebody, is that as close as you got to the actual smoking gun, identifying Grant as a British agent?
That was the most explicit bit, but the other evidence adds up. As I say, I was led into it, first of all, by the knowledge, which obviously nobody here would have, that he was a cousin of the Colonial Secretary. There are also timings. He turns up in certain places. He knows people. There's a letter which he wrote to Austin saying, "Oh, I'm doing this. It's all right. I'm on your side." And we've got corresponding stuff from the other, telling a very different story. We've got Grant's boss, Henry Ward, who wrote a wonderful book entitled Mexico in 1827, in which he described his wanderings, his reports on the mines, this business of going north and missing a coup in Mexico City, but saying nothing at all about Fredonia. And he got recalled immediately afterwards. And in his book he describes how, well, the weather was a bit rough and Mrs. Ward was feeling a bit poorly, so we called in by New York, and this was an excellent opportunity for me to meet my old school friend Charles Vaughan, the British minister in Washington. And it all passed off very innocuously until you read the actual correspondence at the time in the Foreign Office archives. And a totally different picture emerges, where he's recalled and he has to give the captain of the ship written orders to go to New York. They didn't get there by accident. They went there under protest because he gave him this written order that he must go to Washington to speak to Vaughan, to brief him on what had happened. And it's things like this that build up. I'll cheerfully admit I've put together a case. But it's a case which involves clandestine operations in an age when the phrase plausible deniability may not have been invented, but it was certainly practiced. It's probably best summed up by the Earl of Castlereagh, who was the predecessor of Grant's ultimate boss, who was in charge of the Irish Secret Service. And he was pressed for a report on the recent activities, and they said, "You have got to be joking. If I give you a report, it won't be secret any longer."
He referred to that as an Irish question.
He referred to it as rather an Irish proposition, yes.
The next question, the next most frequently asked question, was to ask Miguel, Dr. Gonzalez Quiroga, to comment on how Mexican and perhaps even Texan history is taught from Mexico. I would think especially this particular period. Could you speak to that?
For many years, Texan or U.S. history in general was not taught in Mexico. But since 1960, Daniel Cosío Villegas, one of our foremost political scientists and historians, told us that if one country needed to know U.S. history, that country was Mexico, because of the way it had been profoundly affected throughout its history by the presence of the United States. And since then, there have been rather timid attempts by some universities, particularly El Colegio de México, El Instituto Mora, and the National University, to establish centers for the study of not only American history, but also American institutions and values and so forth, their political system and so forth. And there's been progress, but that hasn't filtered down to the public education system. Our students at the elementary and secondary school level and high school level don't know anything at all about U.S. history, much less Texas history. And I dare say most of our university students who don't take any history courses don't know anything about it either. So there's a profound ignorance in Mexico about Texas history and the United States. We're trying to change that, a few of us. I struggled for years to get a history of the United States put into the curriculum at our university and finally succeeded. But I'm forced to teach the history of the United States, not Texas, all in one semester. And we dedicate 4 semesters to study Mexican history. So it's not easy, it's not difficult. There's a kind of a nationalistic rejection from a past age, from another period that still pervades our educational system and the way many of those who make decisions in our country decide on budgets for education and the way education should proceed. And so the study of the United States and Texas history is not one of our, has not been one of our priorities, although I personally think, as a person who has lived in the border region all his life, that it should be.
There's a question for Steve Harrigan, from a respectful dissenter from your point of view on the line in the sand. Some other people suggested sources such as Madame Candelaria, Enrique Esparza, Juana Alsbury, as people who may have spoken to what was going on inside the Alamo, and wondered whether there were other non-Zuber commentaries on the line in the sand.
Well, I may respectfully accede to the respectful dissenters on this subject, because it's been a long time since I've been studying this issue, and I've read all those sources at the time. I just came to this conclusion that the basics linchpin upon which this whole story of the line in the sand hung was Zuber, and Zuber to me is transparently false or made up. I mean, he essentially says so himself. So it seems like everybody else is sort of backing and filling to support this essentially fictional story. Like a lot of these people were interviewed again in the kind of age of purple prose in the late 19th century, and I think a lot of words were put into their mouths. So in a number of issues like this, the line in the sand, the death of Crockett, all these issues which are of extreme importance to people who have been obsessed with the Alamo since childhood, you have to sort of, particularly as a novelist, as I say, you have to make a decision. Am I going to go with this, or am I not going to go with it? And finally you come to a point where not just the preponderance of evidence, but the preponderance of intuition weighs you toward one conclusion or another. And I am not prepared or inclined to argue with a lot of people here who have studied this probably in more depth than I have, and for a longer period, and are more conversant with it at the moment. But all I can say is that I looked at all these sources, I talked to lots of people about them, and decided that I just didn't believe that there was this moment happened.
Yeah, well, one thing I would like to augment something that Steve said earlier today, and that is about the progressive deterioration of the reliability of Susanna Dickinson's comments as one newspaper reporter after another interviewed her and asked her leading questions. The same thing happens with Enrique Esparza. And I'm not even going to touch Madame Candelaria because she's pretty well been debunked as a source. But if someone could point to a pre-Zuber account of the line in the sand, it would be very helpful, but it doesn't exist. And so that, Zuber kind of poisoned the well. And to the extent that he created that story, and then everyone is asked about the Zuber story. And they're asked when they're very old, and they're asked when they're giving their umpteenth interview. And if you follow those interviews with Mrs. Dickinson especially, you can see her being led by her questioners. Is that a fair statement?
It's very fair, and I would point out again, if you read the Adjutant General testimony of Susanna Dickinson in 1876, the profound difference between how she comes across there as to how she comes across in these florid newspaper articles is just extraordinary. On the subject, for instance, of the death of Crockett, they asked her about Crockett, and she says, he was killed, she believes. I mean, that was her comment on the death of Crockett. And in other newspaper articles, they have really taken this, made her such a vivid eyewitness to events that she apparently or did not, says she didn't witness, basically, when she was under oath. So I think, you compare and contrast these documents, the newspaper stories that are often cited in, recirculated again and again and again in histories, and the closest you can come to actual on the ground or at least credible memories. The same is true with during the siege itself. To me, the most important information is from Travis's letters. It's from Almonte's diary, even though we don't have the holographic pages of that, and from Ramirez de Sesma's account. I mean, those are, to me, not totally irrefutable, but coherent and absolutely from that moment in which they took place.
Put your hand up if you've heard of the Dolson letter. A minority. I just wrote an article for the Journal of the West last spring on the Dolson letter from Texas. It was written on Galveston Island in the summer of 1836 by a bilingual Texan sergeant who had just participated in the debriefing of a Mexican officer who described the capture and the execution of David Crockett. And this letter, again, was written in the summer of 36, published in the Detroit Democratic Free Press in the September of 1836, and then forgotten until a Rice University graduate student ran across it in an old, faded, small print, hard copy newspaper in 1960. And although the graduate student misinterpreted the letter, as many people still do who aren't really careful, that Dolson letter is by far the best information, as far as I'm concerned, on how Davy Crockett died. If De La Pena just doesn't come close to being as good a source on the death of Crockett as this Dolson letter. And so if you want to find out what I think, as opposed to what he thinks, about how Davy Crockett died, take a look at the Journal of the West, spring 2007. It's published out of Kansas State University, and it's essentially a documentary analysis. We actually did this issue of the Journal of the West, edited by my friend, the Latin American historian Richard Slata, as a way of teaching the American West. And every article is a different way, a unique or innovative way of teaching the American West in the classroom. And my contribution was documentary analysis. Here's something that has to do with documents, and it's for Drianna Belden. We all know that some of us know that the Texas State Historical Association, having been evicted from the University of Texas at Austin campus after more than a century of being there, is moving to the University of North Texas, I guess next fall, Drianna, is that right?
That's right, October.
In October, and they're wondering what will the consequences be, pro or con, good or bad, when the Handbook of Texas interface with the portal may be affected by that move in one way or another.
Well, I'm not sure what the eventual plan is. I know the Handbook of Texas Online is coming with TSHA when they come up to Denton. Whether they intend to maintain that themselves or have us help them with that in some way is unclear still. So, we're really excited that they're moving up to Denton. There's so much great opportunity for collaboration and doing some great things together. Stephen Cure and I have known each other for a while. He's the education coordinator there at TSHA. And since they're moving up there just 2 months ago, he put in a grant proposal where he's got this great idea for this innovative project that he wants to maintain, and we're going to help them out with the technical end. So I just think there's, in the future years, a lot of great fruits are going to come out of this collaboration between the two of us. But as far as the Handbook of Texas Online, I'm not sure what the eventual plans are for that yet. So
You don't see any negative results? Certainly, Dr. McLean.
It occurred to me that in all those 100 years, when people gave something to the Texas State Historical Association, did they turn around and give it to UT Austin? Did they get a receipt? or did they just put it on the shelf? If that happened, then they can recall what they own and take it with them.
Don't tell them.
I frankly don't know.
No, Dr. McLean was speaking about what happened to people who gave things to the TSHA or to the University of Texas, and what
Just those that gave to Texas State Historical
to the Texas State Historical.
did not pass ownership to UT Austin.
Sure.
If there's no written receipt from UT Austin, it still belongs to the association.
One of the way the relationship has been best described to me between the TSHA and the University of Texas at Austin, because it was not a contractual relationship, is that of a common law marriage. And I'm serious about that, because it was not a contractual relationship. And we live now, unfortunately, at universities in the United States in an age of super lawyer contractual relationships, and every I dotted and every T crossed. Whether or not there will be a fight, as Dr. McLean may have suggested, between the TSHA and the University of Texas over items that were given to the TSHA, passed on to UT, but with no receipt given, God only knows. But from what I've been able to tell from talking to people at the TSHA, they are determined to make this a positive change. It's going to be very sad for us who go back to Austin to do research, who use the Center for American History, not to have the TSHA upstairs. And it's going to be very sad, I think, for a lot of people who are forced to choose between keeping their jobs and living in Austin. It's going to be very difficult in some cases, before Drianna has every document online. It's going to be difficult for people at the TSHA always to go to the archival sources in the way they've been able to just by going downstairs in the Sid Richardson building. But I think it was a pretty sad moment when the University of Texas at Austin decided that Texas history for the people of Texas was too parochial a subject for a world-class university like UT Austin to get its hands dirty with. That's one side of it. It's not the whole truth. There was some culpability on the part of the TSHA too in terms of keeping their house in order. But rather than air any more dirty laundry, I'm going to go on to the next question, and that's for Betsy. One of our audience members does presentations on the Goliad Massacre for 7th graders, and has been told by 2 different school districts that they were afraid to take these because of the controversial nature of the subject. How do you deal in a classroom with 4th graders, and we could ask for commentary with other teachers too, on potentially sensitive material? And many of you know that's one in particular situation which has engendered a great deal of controversy, even to the point of what words you use when you're talking about the event of Palm Sunday of 1836.
You know, I think that it's important to me that you set the stage. I've been really lucky to work with principals that are real open-minded. And from that point of view, in talking to them, and it's how you set the stage. I've been able to bring in different people who are more controversial and be able to take my kids to different places because of how I set the stage. I think that's the most important thing for everything that you do. I mean, when we went to the Alamo, my kids saw James, but they were also there, and they had so much background information and were prepared that it was an exciting moment for them. I kind of do it in the same light that, you know, you've seen Van Gogh's Starry Night so many times in the paper, or I mean in a book, and you've heard about it, but when you see it in person, it's so different. It's the same thing. So like if you prepare your kids and you prepare them in a way that's appropriate for them, when they come to speak, then it's not an issue. And that's, you know, that's just how it is. I mean, it's how you prepare, and if your principal has trust in what you're doing, then it's okay. So I've just been lucky. I think that it's, there's controversy out there in all things. I mean, whether you bring in and you link current events. If I'm linking current events to things in Iraq, and I have to be very careful as to my political point of view. And even today when I'm talking about, testing or however, I try to be unbiased about it, although I definitely have opinions. But I think that it's all in, it's all in how you prepare them and getting it across. And I think that they need to be able to see and hear different points of view and how you bring it up and how you wrap it up. I mean, my kids can talk about, study the Holocaust at different times through novels that we're doing to a higher degree because it's how you present the information. There's a lot out there about the Holocaust that's not necessarily appropriate for fourth graders, but it can be handled in a way that's appropriate.
One of the questions I've found, whether it's dealing with fourth graders or 80-year-olds, and that is, what do we know and how do we know it? Whether we're talking about the death of Davy Crockett or the killings at Goliad, start by reconstructing what we know and how we know it, by building up, as you say, laying the foundation, rather than jumping in and saying, okay, was it a good thing or a bad thing, or did he surrender or not, or do you think we ought to call it a massacre? If you start with that question rather than the facts as reported by the contemporaries and by the documents that we have, then you're leading, you're going to have a fight no matter what. At least if you start with the facts, you can get people fighting over documents instead of semantics, and that helps sometimes at least. This is a direct question, a factual question for Stuart Reed. Tell us about the Battle of Agua Dulce Creek and how Dr. Grant died.
You want the short answer or the detailed answer?
I think the medium short answer.
The medium
today.
short. The medium short is that they were returning from the Rio Grande, where incidentally they'd run into Comanches, amongst other things. They spent the night at a hacienda, name of which I forget, doesn't really matter. While they were sleeping there, the people at the hacienda sent word up to Orea to warn them that they were coming. And as they were crossing Agua Dulce Creek with a large herd of horses which they picked up on the Rio Grande, the horses slowed to drink. Grant and two of his companions, Placido Benavidez and Georgian named Reuben Brown, drew away from the rest of the party. Shortly after they did this, Orea's men rushed out of the trees and attacked the main body. Grant, Benavidez and Brown turned around, saw that the men were already surrounded. The fight, there appears to be more of a fight than is sometimes suggested in the book. That putting the various accounts together from the survivors and from Orea's account and a couple of others, there does seem to have been a fair bit of fighting, brief, but they were fighting. The trouble was they were caught completely by surprise. According to one of Reuben Brown's later memoirs, one of his earliest memoirs, although it took a long time to surface, they had blankets draped over the shoulders and they were singing. Sadly, for history and everything else, he failed to record what they were singing, but it's just a nice thought. Out came Orea, got them surrounded, got them split up, got them scattered. The Americans tried to make a fight for it in the village itself of Agua Dulce. The Mexicans, the Tejanos, tried to run for it and were cut down by the Lancers. Some got away. Most of them apparently didn't. Benavidez was sent off to warn Fannin. Grant and Brown tried to go in, fight. Running melee with loose horses everywhere. They went in. Brown lost his horse, mounted Major Morris's horse, and they decided, right, let's go for it, and they tried to make a break for it. Ran 8 miles before they were finally run down. Brown's horse gave out, he was forced to surrender. Grant surrounded, dismounted, and was talking to his captor when another lancer came up and stabbed him in the back. There are a surprising number of accounts, but synthesizing them down, that particular account by Reuben Brown seems to be the most reliable. De la Peña refers to it having spoken to Urrea, who was his friend, and Urrea claimed that he'd tried to save Grant, that he didn't want him killed, but it was this officer who wanted his silver-mounted saddle that had killed him, which is possible, but I have a lingering suspicion that given that Grant was a Federalist, that Urrea was a Federalist, that Grant had been down the Rio Grande in the first place trying to organise the Federalists down there, including Canales and so on, that he was simply too dangerous to live, that he knew too much to be allowed to survive, and that so far as Urrea was concerned, it was very convenient that he died there. Does that answer your question?
One more. Thank you. One more for Miguel. This I thought was an interesting question. I'll read it verbatim. If Mexican citizens, such as Stephen F. Austin, Lorenzo de Zavala, James Bowie, William B. Travis, and Ben Milam, there's a motley crew for you, had survived, do you believe the conflicts of the 1840s would have been less fierce and bloody?
I don't know. I think it's useful always for a society to have pragmatic, intelligent, and reasonable men making decisions. But there are variables here that we cannot know. For example, the pressure which existed prior to Texas independence, and which surely continued and would have continued anyway from many Southern racists who were coming into the territory and adopting a very aggressive position against Mexico and Mexicans. They weren't too very much interested, as far as I can see, in conciliation or cooperation or peaceful coexistence with Mexico and Mexicans. So I'm not sure. It's not something that I've thought very much about, but if you give me a chance and invite me back, maybe I can look into it.
Excellent answer. I've often thought that it was too bad for the loss of the institutional memory and the historical memory of Stephen F. Austin and Lorenzo de Zavala at the same time, virtually. That was a real loss, I think, for the Texas Republic. And given Zavala's contacts and connections to Mexico as well as Stephen F. Austin's, that was probably a greater loss. Things may have been better with Travis out of the way. It's a little hard to say. Travis perhaps had a slightly different approach to Mexico than those two. And a final quick question, and I'll ask Jeff to just sort of wander up when he thinks we've gone on long enough, and I'll turn over the program to him. A question's for Steve Harrigan, a two-part question. Did James Michener's approach to novels affect your approach to a historical novel? And did your historical novel in any way form the background for the recent Alamo movie?
When I was in high school, I read a lot of James Michener's novels, Hawaii and those kind of things, and really admired them for their informed bulk. They were really. He invented something really marvelous. I think this kind of panoramic, universal lens through which to see a region. When you live in that region your whole life, and then you read the book, the Michener book about it, it's a different experience. And I remember when I was at Texas Monthly, one of my jobs was to review Michener's novel. And the first line of my review was that there are great novels, and then there are great big novels. and that was said with all due respect to Michener and his accomplishments, but it gave me an insight into, at that time I was a magazine journalist, and I began to understand from reading a book like this how inherently superficial you have to be to take on a subject that you're not born and bred to in a way. And it was a great insight to me. And again, with great admiration for Michener and everything he accomplished. But I don't think that his novel influenced mine in any particular way, other than that I was glad that it didn't close the door on future kind of doorstop novels about Texas. As far as the movie, which came out in 2004, no, my book did not influence that movie in any particular way. I mean, there are little tiny things I think that might have been triggered by the book, but at that time when my book came out, Ron Howard had already been developing an Alamo movie, and at one point he invited Jim Crisp and Steve Harden and a number of other historians, and he generously included me in that gathering, and we talked to him about what kind of movie this should be. For I think, wasn't it 8 hours or something, Jim?
Yeah, we did a whole day and a half, if you count Goliad the next day.
That's right, yeah. And so that, I guess to some degree, there was an influence that sort of percolated through to that, although by that time, John Lee Hancock had taken over the movie. And so it's a very different, the movie, The Alamo, is a very different movie than I would have written. It's a very different movie than any that would have been based on my book. I'm an admirer of the movie. It has its problems. I think one of the problems it has is that it wanted to include the Battle of San Jacinto, which I think was a sound instinct, but the reality of actually making a movie with action scenes dictates that and what looks like on the page would work for a regular length movie. When you put a battle scene, it just expands it in terms of time so much that the movie kind of outgrew its boundaries and had to be edited down to such a way that it wasn't always totally coherent. So, but anyway, there are sort of three monster opuses about the Alamo in that period. There was Michener's book, there was the Alamo movie, and then to some degree or other, mine was a monster in the sense that it was long. And they all, I think, were very distinct.
I think it's really too bad that a movie hasn't been made of Gates of the Alamo. I think it would be a marvelous movie and not the same movie at all, like you say. Let me try, if I can, and this will be my last comment, and then I see that Jeff has wandered up, so that means I have to wander off. I want to try to put together the last two questions and answers from Miguel and from Steve. And my problem with the Michener book, which I left half unread, I stopped around the time of the Mexican War in that book, was because what Michener tried to do in that book, as he's done in perhaps successfully in other books, is to use a single character to represent a people. And he takes the young man, whose name I forget now, who was raised by a Mexican stepmother or godmother.
Is it Otto?
It may have been Otto, yeah. And he makes him turn into a fairly virulent racist. And it simply doesn't work. What happens is that Texas takes a turn during the time of the Texas Republic, largely for the kinds of things that Miguel spoke about just a few minutes ago, with this new crowd of people coming in with no experience of living in cooperation with Mexicans or the Mexican nation. And also you had this border warfare going on, and also Texas started getting weak and started getting broke by the early 1840s, and that can turn people sour. I think some politician recently said bitter. Racism is not a given, and poor race relations are not a given. They develop over time in particular historical circumstances. I know that Mexican diplomat that I was talking to last week said that what he learned as a well-educated Mexican 30 years ago was that all of the Americans who came into Mexican Texas and the Texas Republic were vicious racists. And he's now learned that that's not true, that it's a more complex question and a more complex situation. And what we've tried to do in this 8th year of the San Jacinto Symposium is try to dip into that complexity in a way that helps make sense of all this for our audiences and for the people who see the DVDs. And I hope we can keep doing it for 8 more. Thank you very much.
I'd like to give a round of applause to all our speakers and Jim Kress. I think we had just an outstanding day today. Thank you very much for coming here.